Great. Welcome everyone to our Trimble webinar this morning. My name is Allison McDuffie. I direct education outreach efforts at Trimble, primarily for the buildings group, but also civil engineering and geospatial. And Richard Hassler is here. He's a market manager in the geospatial group. And we're going to talk about a great project we've been working on now for almost 4 years, I think, around the transatlantic slave trade and sites associated with such. We did do a webinar, I think, about 3 years ago after we collected data from our first site. So this is going to be a huge update on the efforts of the last few years. I'd like to start off our presentation with this fact, really, from the Getty Conservation Institute. And losing cultural heritage sites worldwide really is happening at an alarming rate. And many of these sites all over the world have not been documented in 3D. So we're going to talk about what we're doing in the US and the Caribbean to help with some of those efforts. We'll start off, since we're US focused on our efforts, talking about in the United States these types of dwellings, which are former enslaved people's dwellings, their homes, throughout the 16th, 17th, 18th century, 19th century as well. These were where people lived on estates or plantations, and there are very few of these actually intact and left throughout the U.S. This particular one in South Carolina was dismantled and reconstructed and preserved, and now sits in the National Museum of African American History and Culture in D.C. I saw this in person, and it's a pretty incredible experience. The whole museum is a pretty incredible experience, but this was especially of interest to me. A little bit of information about the slave trade. We're going to show a quick video on slave 1,000 voyages. So these are visual ships in the span of around 2 minutes, and we'll talk a little bit about some facts about the transatlantic slave trade. When Richard and I started on this project, I thought that I knew a lot about the slave trade, and I learned very quickly that I knew very little. So this has been pretty enlightening over the last few years to really grasp the enormity of this period in our history.
Each dot, by the way, on the screen represents a slave ship in its voyage across the Atlantic.
During the transatlantic slave trade, it was really a forced migration of up to 15 million people to the Western Hemisphere. And there have been, documented so many crimes against the millions of deaths due to violent travel conditions, forced labor, torture, and murder. America's prosperity was built on the back of enslaved peoples. We can directly relate everything that's associated with our institutions today on being built from enslaved people. There's an enduring legacy of racial stereotypes and prejudices and racial violence, as well as Eurocentric views about Africa still exist today due to the slave trade. And of course, we all know there have been centuries of wars and politics have been formed around the issue of slavery. When you think that on each individual voyage there were anywhere from 200 to 500 people in the cargo hold of these ships, it's really this is quite the experience for me to watch this. Great, good, move on to the next one. So a little bit about how we got involved in this and what our focus and goals and all of that stuff were. We attended a conference in late 2013 in London that was focused on documenting world cultural heritage sites, and particularly through 3D laser scanning, 3D data being collected. We kind of organized with the folks who ran that conference that since we make the equipment and the processing software to do this sort of work, that we wanted to be involved in some way. And so we ended up choosing this theme around the slave trade, particularly in the US and the Caribbean, because it's not something that had been documented before. So we have come to, over the years, focus more on actually slave dwellings as opposed to mansions or estate homes and that sort of thing. Those are all preserved, and you can go tour them in the Southeast at will, and you'll get lots of information about a plantation owner and their home, and it'll be outfitted with period things. But it's rare that you'll be able to go into slave dwelling and get that side of the story. So that's part of what we're trying to do here. As I said, lots of structures around the world are lost to things like natural disasters, human aggression, just neglect over time, and they're not documented. And many of the ones we're doing are really around neglect more than anything. Let's see, one of the pieces of motivation for us also is that we get to showcase a lot of our technologies in a really unique way. I think you're going to see, Richard's going to go into a deep dive about the technologies later, and you'll get to see that we employ a lot of different things on a site, and then we come back and process and create outputs that are using a lot of different things. It's not just a laser scanner. So he'll go into that in just a second. It also allows us to engage with other people, historians. We'll talk about in a minute some of our partners, university folks, local communities, and to pull out and be able to create comprehensive case studies from it. We've been in a number of publications, blogs. We've talked at conferences and trade shows about this. And we also try and pull in our local regional partners, some of these projects to come to a site and help us document. So it really is, our goals are really telling this story through a new 3D lens, creating also curriculum, primarily K-12 curriculum that's free and accessible for teachers, and then to leverage partnerships and build technical capacity. Like I said, we've actually documented our first site in the fall of 2014. To date, we've documented around 25 individual structures at 7 sites throughout the Southeast U.S. and the U.S. Virgin Islands, plus a really cool project that we did last summer in documenting an 18th century British tall ship, which is a replica that's at the Maritime Museum of San Diego and was in dry dock at the time. So you can see a list of the technologies, just some of them actually that we've used. And Richard, like I said, will go into more detail about that in a second. We did set some criteria for narrative and site selection, and the academic focus areas that you see here, around capture, confinement, transport, life and labor, and that sort of stuff was really something that from the beginning we defined. And we also, site selection criteria is around risk, how badly deteriorated is a place, is it at risk of being demolished, that sort of thing. We have lots of academic advisors and partners, which we're really proud of building over the last 3 years. The people that are kind of highlighted in blue here are the ones that we're most actively involved with. Dr. Peter Wood is a former professor at Duke University, and U.S. slavery is his topic. And he just happens to live here in Colorado, close by, and so we have great, easy access to his knowledge. Dr. Henry Lovejoy is a professor at CU Boulder, so he's right here as well, and he is an African Studies professor. And then Joby Hill is an architect specializing in historic preservation, and she founded an organization called SavingSlaveHouses.org, and we have most recently been working a lot with her, which Richard will go into. But future partners that we're really excited about, the Slavery Images Database. If any of you have heard of that, or if you haven't, go do a Google search on it. But it is the most widely used database of illustrations and images from the times of slavery in the world. And so we're about to add some 3D data to that database, which is pretty exciting. And Henry Lovejoy at CU has just become the new director. We'll talk about that in a minute as well. And at Michigan State University, there's a big project going on, and we'll talk about that in just a second. We started out when we first got going with having this interactive map built out. It gives you kind of points on a map that are clickable, and you can see ports of departure, ports of arrival, and numbers of people associated with those voyages, as well as regions indicated by those large circles about numbers of people departing and arriving in a particular region. One thing that I was not aware of when we first started doing this project was the number of people that were transported from Western Africa to the Caribbean and Brazil. Wow. I mean, wow. 10 million people. I mean, it's crazy. So in comparison, the number of people who were directly came from West Africa to the U.S. was far less, but many of people came from the Caribbean to the U.S. As well. This map is, I just want to say, is lived on a partner site, SciArc.org, and it's no longer accessible because they've kind of switched up their interface. But for a while, that was being heavily used. Our first site was in Mississippi at Natchez National Historic Park. This is an estate home that had about 25 people enslaved and serving the owners there. And so a team of us went down, some local partners came with us, and we spent about 3 full days in sweltering heat and humidity documenting the site. And Richard will talk more about that in a minute. Some of the outputs on this site were this landing page on SciArc.org. This still exists, so you can go and search this on SciArc's website under the themes tab at the top there. And this 3D model is actually a SketchUp model that you can zoom in and out in orbit, and you can get more information about the site, the history of the site, and some data points as well. This shows the in-depth and media gallery links where you can go and see some walkthrough videos and other data stuff. So there was another site in Natchez that we documented called the William Johnson House. William Johnson was a man who was born into slavery and was actually emancipated when he was a teenager by the slave owner's wife, and lived throughout. He was still lived through the times of slavery, died before the Civil War ended. So it's a really unique story, and we only know about it because he kept a very detailed diary. He became a really successful barber and businessman in Natchez. And so this is a historic site where he lived and ran his business. The second site we documented was on the island of St. John. And this is an old sugar plantation that was owned by Denmark. And this was really, really something to see. This site is at risk because the vegetation is overtaking it. And a lot of it, as you can see, is in ruins, but really significant historical site. You can see the team of people that were involved both in documenting and are writing the history of this site as well. It's a national park, and the park geologist also hosted us, and we worked in tandem there. And this is some of the outputs on SciArc's website, and some more media gallery and in-depth information on that site. The third site that we documented was the McLeod Plantation in James Island in South Carolina. And these particular slave dwellings, this is an interesting location and site because it's run by people who tell the story of the majority of people who lived here, which were enslaved people. And there are not many places, as I mentioned earlier, in the U.S. that tell that story. They called this row of slave dwellings actually Transition Row because they were actually inhabited by people up until the mid-1990s. So there's a continuing story for another, century about these dwellings. And so they're wonderful people at this site. If you're ever in South Carolina, I highly suggest visiting this. It's quite the experience. So we took a group of teachers down here as well to visit from Boulder Valley School District. And this is some of the point cloud imagery of those same dwellings on the top mid up to the top right. And then the lower left side, a dairy building and a kitchen building, which were almost always separate buildings back in the day. So the next thing that we documented was this British tall ship that I mentioned. And these are just some images from that weekend spent doing this. Peter Wood is on the right, our historian from Duke, who came along, and one of our colleagues on the left, Brian Stutzman. And these are some of the scan data that came from that collection. And these are some of the other assets that were created. We had a summer intern on the SketchUp team from the University of Minnesota. Peter Klusak is his name, who spent a considerable amount of time modeling, doing a 3D model in SketchUp of based on this slave ship, but actually using historic data from a ship called the Charleston. And so that's what this model is of, and these are some renderings that we're showing, in addition to the interior of the ship, which we think is a really important thing to see and to experience. And so we have taken this model into a HoloLens environment and also into a Google Cardboard environment. And the top right picture is a day we spent at a middle school here in Boulder, and of kids getting to experience that, going through this ship at a 1-to-1 or a 1-to-20 scale, or whatever you have the ability to do in HoloLens. So.
Just a quick insert here. The historian estimates that the density of the people in the lower right image is roughly 3/5 of what really would have been held in the hull of this ship.
Yeah.
So you can get some kind of feeling for what that weeks-long passage across the Atlantic would have been like.
Yeah, horrible conditions. You know, anyone who fell ill on a journey was pretty much tossed overboard. So, pretty brutal conditions. This I talked about cardboard and getting this model in there, and so this is pretty exciting stuff. This is an experience where you can actually the scan data goes from RealWorks to Undeck to SketchUp to a Unity workflow. And we're launching an alpha with test audiences this month on this experience. But essentially, if you go to the next slide, the red dot on the little inset there indicates where you are on the ship. And you essentially click through where you want to go. So this gives you an idea about what the experience looks like in Google Cardboard. And it's really important to have an experience like this in a device that is very inexpensive. K-12 schools will never own a HoloLens device, but they do actively use Google Cardboard. So, and then the next sites we documented were last summer in fall, is that correct?
August.
In last August, right. And this is work with Joby Hill, the architect that I mentioned earlier. She has a great organization. She is a powerhouse team of one who goes around surveying and documenting sites that contain slave homes. And so we've teamed up with her. We met her at a conference a few years ago, and she's been great to work with. So Richard and a few other people from our team went to Virginia, and also spent a number of days in sweltering heat with machetes, cutting back vegetation to get access to some of these structures. So some of the 3D images there, and I just want to show, this is a video that one of our colleagues, Jason Hayes, created that Joby submitted to the Smithsonian Institution as a proposal to get additional funding to continue doing this work, and with which we will help. So I'll let this run for just a minute so you can get an idea about what these sites look like in the beautiful data that was collected.
inside the slave ship, Apollo lens.
Terrific reaction from kids on this. I mean, just completely enthralled. So. Please check out Joby's savingslavehouses.org site when you get a chance. We talked a little bit about incorporating into K-12 curriculum, and so we've worked with a group of teachers from the Boulder Valley School District and an organization called Impact on Education that supports BVSD. And so a team, many of us from Trimble have made multiple visits to both elementary, middle, and high schools to talk about how you collect this type of data, what happens after you collect it, and how you create outputs that people can consume. So these are some photographs from some of those visits. And these are some of the lesson plans that live in both on SIARC site and on Impact site with BVSD folks as well. Really proud to say that once we got moving with teachers on this, both at the fifth grade level, at the middle school level, and at the high school level, 3 new courses were actually written and submitted to Boulder Valley School District Superintendent and were approved that address slavery. And so you can see at the top there at the elementary school, it was around the slave trade and social action, around a course called Human Rights at the middle school level, which includes the slave trade and other slavery around the world. And then at the high school, the history and impact of slavery. We talked about Henry Lovejoy, a professor at CU, and this is about the Slavery Images Database, of which he's the new director. And so this is just some information about what we're looking to do with him, which is going beyond just JPEG images and actually adding something that's a little more immersive in your experience. And then Michigan State University just received a ginormous grant from the Mellon Foundation to do a proof of concept on taking primarily academic historians, disparate sites that address slavery historically. Everybody has a different specialty, right, in that area, and there are websites on platforms created all over the place, but there's not one landing page where you can go to kind of integrate all of those to get the whole story. And so they're working on that technological challenge, and they're in phase 1 right now, but our data sets will be included at phase 3. So this is a really exciting thing for us. And then lastly, what we're looking at as well is going ahead now. We have so much data, it's kind of in disparate places. And so we're looking at building our own landing page on Trimble.com within the geospatial area of our website. And so stay tuned for that to come. And now Richard will go into a much deeper dive about the technology.
Okay, so you've seen snippets of each of the sites. So I just wanted to talk about the technologies that were used to capture those sites and some of the techniques that we've employed along the way, and some additional discussion. The Trimble TX8 is figured very prominently in a lot of this work. Fundamentally, we scan and collect other data. Typically, we don't just collect the other kinds of data. For the Virgin Islands site, it was rather large. It was roughly a half of a mile long. And between the Annenberg main site and the secondary site that we picked up that was the master's house, total was closer to a mile long. But more importantly, it was on the side of a very large mountain. This is all part of the Virgin Islands National Park on St. John, and including some of the areas in the water, which are underwater national park and good for scuba diving and whatnot. We didn't get to enjoy and frolic the vacationer's life in this area. We worked pretty hard to capture the entire site as best we could. There were actually 4 different areas of collection on this project, and we wanted to try to tie them together. So we used the UX5, formerly Trimble drone that we used to have, a UAS system, and planned out very carefully how to fly this to provide a surface model for the context for all of the other scan data. And it is pretty tricky when you have a very large mountainside like that to plan your flight path so you don't fly into the mountain when you're trying to capture the images. So there was quite a bit of Google Earth planning. You can see on the lower right some potential flight lines that were being considered